Hello, this is Professor Leone, and this is our video lecture on Chapter 4 of the Elements of Moral Philosophy. Does morality depend on religion? Now, many people, in particular in American culture, believe that the only source of ethical or moral guidance comes from your faith. The reasoning goes something like this. The purpose of life is written through God's plan in His creation of the universe. And so, since God is the creator of meaning in life, He must then also be the source of determining what is good and right in life. So, if God's plan determines what's moral, then it is only through knowing God that you can figure out what's moral. Um, Many of us were raised with that thinking, and the corollary to it, which is that if someone is, say, an atheist or an agnostic or not a theist, doesn't have a particular religious foundation, then they must be immoral, because the only source of ethical thinking or moral direction and guidance would come from knowing God's plan. Now, in our society, we have a secular government. We have a secular um, state and federal institutions. Schools are not allowed to, at least public schools are not allowed to have particular denominations given preference. So it causes a bit of a rift. If morality can only come from religion, how then can our government or our schools have ethics or morality? It leaves us in a bit of a bind. Of late, well, by of late I mean from the 70s, 1970s forward, many people's solution to this was to bring their religion into government and schools and try to tear down the separation of church and state that this country was founded on. Um, that is not necessarily working out so well because we are a um, country that has a multiplicity of religions. So if we are going to base our morality only on our religions, and we have more than one religion tolerated in our country, then we're going to have a lot of disruption and disagreement and a basic inability to get along and make our country function. Um, and that's what a lot of things look like. Let me posit something different, which is the argument presented to us in Chapter 4, that perhaps morality and ethics is not dependent upon religion. One might be a theist and have faith in a particular god or gods, but that is in parallel with your ethical understanding or your moral guidance. It's not the same thing. And let's look at the history of religious moral thinking and unpack it a little bit and see why I might be able to make a claim that morality does not at all come from religion. All right, if we begin our chapter, we're going to start with uh, something that is called, or a paradigm that is called, the divine command theory. Now, this is descriptive after the fact, talking about how various faiths believe morality comes from their religion. And as you can see, we've got Christians, Jews, Muslims. You can include pretty much any theist. In fact, the discussion from our text will center on Plato. And Plato is an ancient Greek classical philosopher, and he is talking about the Greek gods, plural. So even before Christ. So let's look at divine command theory in history and what does it say? So the divine command theory is the basic idea that God, or gods if you're Plato, decides what is right or wrong. It's a popular or attractive idea because it does solve the problem of objectivity in ethics. In other words, it's not just your moral opinion, it's an objective fact now, in that it's the fact of what God has said is right or wrong. So that has some attraction to it. But we very quickly find that there are some problems with it. Okay, so problems with the divine command theory. There's two ways to look at the divine command theory. What does it mean to say that something is right because God says it so? God says something is right. Plato brings this up, and his criticism via Socrates is something right because the gods command it? In other words, the gods make something right by their decree. If that's the case, then the gods could make anything right. Not just truthfulness, but they could make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches morally right. It's really quite an arbitrary system then, if the gods can decide whatever is going to be right. Now, in the classical Greek theology, the gods were notorious for doing all kinds of questionable things, shenanigans, if you will. So that really has a lot of traction to say, is something right because the gods say it's right? Well, they really could choose just about anything. And then there's something very unsatisfying about that. Anything can be moral, and what the gods choose could be totally arbitrary then. And even worse, there then are not reasons for something being moral or not. For example, child abuse. What if the gods decided that child abuse was moral? It would then be moral because the gods decreed it so. That really takes something away from what we want our ethics and our morality to be. That doesn't really capture the nature of what we're looking for, what we're thinking about when we talk about something being moral. So then let's look at it the other way. Well, maybe, and again, Socrates continues to argue this, maybe then there's another way to go about this. Maybe then things are moral and the gods recognize that something is moral or right or good. And they're simply bringing it to our attention when they state that something is moral. That seems a little more satisfying because then it's not arbitrary. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are not declared morally righteous. And child abuse is not going to be arbitrarily decreed as moral. Instead, the gods simply know and recognize what is right and good, and help us to see it. That is more attractive, but then it leaves us with a different problem. What is moral then is prior to the gods, in Plato's case, and prior to God in a Judeo-Christian case. If what is good is prior to God, then it's also independent of God. And what then do we need God for? God's kind of just I don't know, the tour guide in morality and ethics instead of the source of morality and ethics. And that's a downgrading that most theists and religious people don't want to accept. That isn't the conception they have of their God. So we've found ourselves in kind of a double bind with the divine command theory. So how are we going to get out of this? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, through much writing, are going to come up with a different way of thinking about it, which is the natural law theory. Yes, in the history of Christian thought, in particular Catholic thought, this is the dominant theory. And this breaks down as so. It goes back to Aristotle, because this is Aquinas trying to rewrite Aristotle into Christian dogma, Catholic dogma. And I cover Aristotle in my introduction to philosophy class, but I guess I haven't gone too much into him here. So I'll give a little bit of a background on Aristotle. Aristotle had a belief that the world has a natural rational order to it. Aristotle believed that everything that exists in the natural world has a teleos, or a final purpose, hardwired into it, if you will. So acorns, for example, to use Aristotle's example, are hardwired to grow up into oak trees. And human beings are hardwired to become different kinds of people. And so each of us is hardwired with our own purpose. That's part of, as Aristotle would say, part of nature's plan. Now, through Aquinas, the Catholic Church co-opts this idea, and instead of it being nature's plan, it is of course God's plan, because God created all of nature. So, in the natural law theory, all of the world, all of existence, has a natural, rational order. And we can know it through our God-given reason. So science is not a foe to Christianity or God or, in particular, Catholicism, because God gave us our reason, which allows us to understand the natural order and intrinsic purpose of everything that exists in the world. It's really a very beautiful idea. Of course, I'm biased because I'm raised Catholic, right? So, if everything has its purpose, then all we need to do is discover everything's purpose and then do what we were designed to do, and we will live a moral life according to God's natural, rational plan. Now, there are some serious problems with this. The first problem is that everything that is has to remain the same. You can't have a change then because everything is created with a particular purpose in mind, and it's always that purpose. Um, some would say that this is confusing what is with what should be. They're conflated and become the same thing. Well, let's look at some of the reasons that most of the world rejects natural law theory now, with the exception possibly of, or arguably, of the Catholic Church. Um, the number one rejection of it is that sometimes natural things aren't really good. So let's think about that. Something like disease. There have been a number of cases recently where children were not given medical treatment because it was natural and God's will that they would be sick and die if it's God's will. Uh, so that feels somewhat uh, not good. That feels immoral. So disease, if we can prevent a disease, wouldn't it be good, more moral, to prevent the disease? If we can prevent disasters, maybe if you're born, children go through a stage when they're selfish. We teach children to move past that. We teach children to share. So what isn't always what's good. There's a wonderful play by Voltaire called Candide, in which he kind of makes fun of this idea that it's always the best of all possible worlds. Whatever the world is, everything happens for a reason, right? And so everything is now good. Oh, you got raped? Hey, it's part of God's plan. It's all good. Everything happens for a reason. There's something very disingenuous and not in the spirit of ethical thinking in that. So I'm going to say that sometimes what is natural is bad and immoral. And so I'm going to reject natural law theory that what's natural isn't always good. The second criticism to this is what I already mentioned, that is and should are not the same thing. Here it is here. Um, so how things are is a descriptive statement. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, which is not the same as how things ought to be. Just because the world is a certain way doesn't mean it has to stay that way. I mean, I would like to think that we've made some moral progress, and yes, I'll use the word progress. I would like to think that it is more ethical that we do not own people anymore, and so that we have progressed. Aristotle believed that some people were born slaves. He believed that there was such a thing as a natural slave, and so they would be happiest serving someone and being owned by someone. That kind of thinking kind of came with it into the Catholic dogma because that's part of the thinking on Aristotle's part. Women also didn't have fully rational souls and hence were not capable of being fully human. Those are things I'm going to take some exception to. So perhaps what is isn't what should be. And last but not least, natural laws, as written by Aquinas, are grasped via our God-given reason. If we can grasp the natural laws via our reason, and every human being is blessed with reason, then we don't really need religion to know moral truths. Yet again, we've come to a point where we have found that we can discern morality, ethics, moral truths independent of religion, even within the dogma of the Catholic Church and the natural law theory. So it's something that will continue to bubble up in ways that you don't always see it. We frequently hear natural law theory cited in rejection of homosexuality, right? Well, you're supposed to make babies with sex, therefore it's unnatural not to make babies with sex. Therefore, because it's not natural, it's immoral. But, as I've already said, there's lots of natural things that are not moral, so that argument falls down. Okay, let's look at some particular moral issues. The one that is brought up in our text and the one we will write on in conjunction with studying this chapter is the topic of abortion. Many people believe that Scripture, and in particular I'm going to reference Christian Bible, the Christian Bible, New Testament, believe that Scripture says that there is not, that abortion is immoral. We'll look at some of that in particular. Our author makes the argument that religion, and Scripture in particular, doesn't actually say anything against abortion. And like many topics, our author says instead that, here we go, here it is, this is what I was looking for. When people say that their moral views come from their religion, they are often mistaken. Really, they are making up their own minds about the issues and then interpreting the Scriptures or church tradition in a way that supports the conclusions they've already reached. Of course, this doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen a lot. And it's not just abortion. This happens with really anything you want to assert is as moral, and then people will go and find something in the Bible to support their position. Must Christians condemn abortion? Well, our authors say let's look at the Scriptures. Seems like a good way to go. All right, so we get a quote that is often cited from the Bible, the first chapter of Jeremiah. And let me get the quote here. That's often cited in defense of the pro-life position. Before I formed you in the womb, God is speaking to Jeremiah, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. These words are presented as though they were God's endorsement of the conservative position. It is wrong to kill the unborn because the unborn are consecrated to God. In context, however, these words obviously meant something different. Let's read the whole passage in which they occur. Now the word of the Lord come to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. All right, so and you can read the rest of the passage here. So this passage has nothing to do with abortion. Instead, Jeremiah is asserting his authority as a prophet. He's saying that God told me to speak for him. I tried to say no, but he insisted, and Jeremiah puts the point poetically. God selected him to be a prophet even before he was born. So this, I think, is a great example of how frequently people have decided they have a particular moral position for whatever their actual reasons are, and then they go looking for something in the Bible to support that position. Often it's not the person in particular that has done this, but perhaps their pastor or their minister has done this and has preached this, and they're now accepting it uncritically. So definitely a lot of taking scripture out of context. So is it fair to say that then someone is following the moral teachings of the Bible? Or are they in fact making their own moral decisions and then trying to find it in the Bible? Yeah, I think it's the latter. And we do get, here we go, other biblical passages support what would be quote unquote a liberal view of abortion. 3 times the death penalty is recommended for women who have had sex out of wedlock. Okay, so pretty harsh there. I mean, if we want to get biblical, anyone, well, okay, it's only women who have had sex that are not married should be executed, even though killing the woman would also kill her fetus. Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. This suggests that the fetus has no right to life. Also in Exodus, God tells Moses that the penalty for murder is death. However, the penalty for causing a woman to miscarry is only a fine. The law of Israel seemed to regard the fetus as something less than a person. Why is this important to a Christian? Because the Christian texts are growing out of the law of Israel, so they have to be put in that context. All right. Perhaps then, instead of looking at the Bible, we need to look at the traditions of our particular faiths. Let's look in particular at the Catholic Church tradition. The Catholic Church is going to refer back to natural law theory, and because abortion disrupts a natural process. Hence, disrupting a natural process is seen as against God's will and therefore immoral. But again, if we follow this logic through, then you do wind up not giving your children medicine when they're sick and letting them die because you're thwarting a natural process. And I don't think that's where most of us want to live. It is actually more logically consistent. So for me, though, instead of going down that road, I'm going to instead think, well, maybe natural law theory isn't the way to be moral. So another way to look at it is back to Thomas Aquinas, whether the fetus has a soul. Let's see if we can find that. Okay, so for most of church history, let's see. Thomas Aquinas asked this key question, and he believed whether or not the fetus is murder. The fetus has a soul. If it does, then abortion is murder. If it doesn't, then abortion is not murder, right? Because from a Christian, Catholic, dogmatic point of view, it's not murder to kill animals because they don't have a soul. So, is the fetus an animal or a human being? Well, Aquinas and the dogma of the Catholic Church would say, does the fetus have a soul? Um, so, how are we going to determine that? And for Aquinas, the question is going to be when their bodies take on human shape. So, when do they look human? Now, yeah, you could make an argument that even babies don't look human. Um, we have a lot more knowledge about fetuses and when things look human and when they don't look human and what constitutes human life. Later in the semester, we're going to tackle the question of euthanasia, which is intentionally ending life uh, when someone is terminally ill. We also looked a little bit at the definition of human life earlier when we read a section on, I think it might have even been in the introductory chapter, when we talked about the definition of human life beginning with brain function. So it used to be that the legal definition of the beginning or end of human life was when the heart would start beating or stop beating. We now know that brain function is a much better indicator of whether someone is actually alive or not, whether they're in a vegetative state. The legal form of when you can, for example, take someone's organs for donation is when their brain has ceased to function. That being said, perhaps the true definition of when a fetus becomes a human being is going to be along those same lines. Not when something looks like a human, but when we have brain functionality. And that's a factual question. So, let's see. Contrary to popular belief, the Catholic Church has never officially maintained that the fetus acquires a soul at the moment of conception. Never. Around 1600, however, some theologians began to say that the soul enters the body a few days after conception, so then abortion would be murder even at an early stage. This is a huge change in Catholic thinking, and at the time, it was essentially a meaningless topic. It was, I shouldn't say meaningless, but it was a inconsequential topic. Somebody just picked a few days for no particular reason, and this got written into Catholic dogma. So really it's kind of arbitrary, and we in fact know so much more about the development of the fetus now that I would not be terribly surprised if the Catholic Church even revisited this topic and decided that either abortion, or excuse me, the fetus doesn't become human at conception. Well, that's probably a stretch. But it is a fact that it was a somewhat arbitrary delineation, and it may have come about because the Catholic Church was against even early term abortions before they had a reason to. So you might, let's see, where is it? Next page. I'll just read this part because it's very well said. So today we do know a lot about fetal development, and we can talk about when a fetus becomes human in a scientific, factual way. We can't really talk about when a soul enters the fetus in a scientific, factual way. That's going to be a value claim. Um, and as I said, the Catholic Church has somewhat arbitrarily chosen a few days after conception. So the purpose of reviewing this history is not to suggest that the contemporary church's position is wrong. Not for our author, at least. For all I have said, it may be right. My point rather is this, and this is a very good point. Every generation interprets its traditions to support its favored moral views. Abortion is but one example of this. We could also have discussed the Church's shifting views on slavery, the status of women, or capital punishment. In each case, the moral stance taken by the Church seems not to be derived from the Bible so much as imposed upon it. The arguments in this chapter point to a common conclusion. Right and wrong are not to be understood in terms of God's will. Morality is a matter of reason and conscience, not religious faith. And in any case, religious considerations do not provide definitive solutions to most of the moral problems that we face. All right. Even if we found it in the Bible, that there, or whichever religious text you wanted, that there was some definitive statement as to what God's will is, interpreting texts is so difficult. Knowing God's will is extremely improbable. So to base our ethics on such presumed, really arrogance, is a fool's errand. And instead, it is probably best to go back to our rationality, whether you contend that it's God-given or naturally developed or simply something that all humans share in common. And that is perhaps instead a better foundation for our ethics and our morals. So what then is the purpose of religion, if not to guide our morality? It might still be to give us meaning in life. It might be a lot of other things, but to develop our personal morality, maybe not. To develop or outline our public, secular laws, definitely not. That I'm going to ask us to depend solely on factual evidence and well-reasoned value claims. All right, that is all for tonight. We will talk about the articles on abortion, on